Julian Adler, a beta by the world's rigid designation, surveyed his latest acquisition. Caleb Thorne was a top-tier alpha, a specimen of genetic perfection whose Ivy League trajectory had been violently derailed by a federal mandate. The Bureau of Genetic Continuity cared little for personal ambition. Their only concern was the propagation of superior bloodlines. And so Caleb, with a resume that could fill a server farm and a future that had once seemed limitless, was now here. In Julian's penthouse overlooking Central Park, he was a tool for procreation, a means to an heir Julian was required to produce. The man knelt, his hands cuffed behind his back, a muzzle-like device covering his jaw. His eyes were bloodshot, radiating a fury so potent it seemed to warp the air in the sterile, minimalist room. He wanted to tear Julian apart. Julian couldn't entirely blame him. He felt like a victim himself, a warden in a prison not of his own making. He had no desire for this charade, for orchestrating his own cuckoldry with some fragrant, hand-picked omega. But the rules were the rules, and for betas of his standing, rules were ironclad. His assistant, a prim beta named Marcus, cleared his throat, his expression tight with disapproval. He informed Julian that the alpha was in rut and needed to be dealt with promptly. It was another regulation, a demonstration of dominance. Betas were to administer suppressants to their assigned alphas, a chemical reminder of who controlled whom, a leash on their most primal instincts. With a profound sense of reluctance, Julian picked up the auto-injector from a sterile tray. Caleb's gaze locked onto him, a predator's focus. The muscles in his back and arms coiled, straining against the cuffs with a terrifying metallic groan. If he were free, Julian had no doubt he would be dead. Julian pressed Caleb's head down, his fingers tracing the man's neck to find the swollen, fever-hot gland. He told the younger man to stop fighting it, to accept his fate. He promised Caleb that he would be treated well, that his material needs would be lavishly met. He even explained that the Omega chosen would be to Caleb's liking, that after they fell in love and a beta child was produced for Julian, the Omega would be his to keep. Caleb's forehead rested against Julian's knee, his silence a wall of defiance. The injector hissed as it broke the skin. A muffled grunt escaped Caleb, his body trembling slightly as the chemicals flooded his system. He looked broken. A pang of something uncomfortable twisted in Julian's gut. As the designated master, he reached out and smoothed a hand over Caleb's hair, murmuring a promise that he truly meant to be good to him. Of course, that kindness was conditional. It depended entirely on Caleb's obedience. 3 months later, the kindness had run out. Caleb was still locked in a reinforced room, more feral than the day he'd arrived. He responded to no name, only to rage. He'd somehow managed to break the muzzle, and the moment Julian appeared, he launched himself at the transparent barrier, his teeth bared, aiming for Julian's throat. There were no words, no articulated needs, only a singular, murderous intent. The history file explained it. Caleb was a return. His previous beta owner had tried to force a bond, using dangerous compounds, and had been crippled for his efforts. A predator that had tasted blood was always harder to tame. Other betas in his circle advised Julian to cut his losses, to turn Caleb over to the Bureau's enforcers who would break him physically and permanently. Julian calmly raised a stun gun. The air crackled. Caleb convulsed on the floor, twitching. Julian shook his head with a sigh, murmuring about the trouble with alphas, with rabid dogs. He gave him 1 more week before he would be sent back. For nearly 7 days, Caleb refused all food and water. The primal need to survive began to eclipse his rage. He grew weaker, his defiance slowly eroded by biological necessity. The feral, bloodthirsty glare in his eyes cooled to a sullen ember. When Julian next approached, he called out the name he'd been given, the one that stripped him of his own. The word was a raw, bloody rasp. A short, dry laugh escaped Julian. It was a sound layered with the echo of immense, unthinking power, a sound that could conjure fleets of yachts and private jets out of thin air. He benevolently ordered food to be brought. Through the barrier, he watched Caleb eat and then, with a flicker of his old self, wipe his mouth. His alpha was learning. Marcus presented Caleb with a contract. After a quick scan of the pages, Caleb looked up at Julian. He had a few conditions of his own. Julian's interest was piqued. The man hadn't completely surrendered. Caleb stated that a 2-year gap would be difficult to explain on his academic record. He knew Julian had reviewed his credentials, and he hoped for an opportunity to serve the Adler Corporation. Julian agreed instantly, offering him the position of his personal assistant. Caleb was visibly stunned by the swift acceptance. Julian quipped that it was only fitting for the father of his child. Marcus's shoulders shook, a movement somewhere between a laugh and a sob at the thought of his own impending reassignment. Caleb took a deep breath. They had a deal. Having Caleb Thorne as an assistant was, Julian had to admit, a luxury. The man was brilliant at everything, his temperament now impossibly even. He handled all of Julian's affairs outside the core business with a quiet, relentless efficiency. One morning, feeling a surge of satisfaction, Julian reached out and patted Caleb's head, murmuring that he was a good boy. Caleb's expression went blank for a second before a stiff, artificial smile stretched his lips. He replied that it was his duty to serve Mr. Adler. Julian nodded, pleased. He then informed Caleb that a portfolio of S-Class Omegas had arrived and instructed him to review it in his office later. From the day the top-tier Alpha had been delivered to his doorstep, Julian had been tasked with finding him a partner. It was a galling irony. Julian Adler, a man whose wealth could buy nations, a bachelor by choice, was now forced to play matchmaker. The Bureau's statutes were clear. S-Class Alphas must be paired with S-Class Omegas with a compatibility rating of no less than 80%. It was a fortunate thing he was an Adler. A family with lesser means would never even get a glimpse of such a candidate before their contracted alpha was repossessed by the Bureau. Caleb went through the profiles but found no one suitable, which didn't surprise Julian. He told Caleb there was a gala that evening, an exclusive matching event for the S-Class. Caleb's gaze fell, and he quietly voiced that he did not wish to go. His opinion was irrelevant. At the gala, betas in bespoke suits made deals over champagne, their casual conversation punctuated by casual boasts of corporate takeovers. The alphas and omegas, meanwhile, were displayed like art pieces, their clothing designed to reveal more than it concealed. Caleb stood rigidly by Julian's side, a silent, imposing statue. He was shirtless, his muscles gleaming under a light sheen of oil. A fellow beta heir, a friend of Julian's, couldn't stop staring. The scrutiny made Caleb profoundly uncomfortable, and he tried to shrink behind Julian, an impossible feat given their respective sizes. Julian gripped Caleb's muscular forearm in a gesture of reassurance. The heir complimented Julian on his acquisition, noting his looks, physique, and rumored prowess. Then his tone shifted. He mentioned an A- Omega he owned and wondered if Julian might be interested in a trade. Julian refused immediately. He was here to let Caleb choose for himself. To force a pairing felt too much like slavery. He then inquired about the S-Class Alpha the heir had acquired last year. The man sighed, explaining that the Alpha's genetics were faulty. He'd produced 5 children with 3 different Omegas, and every single one was a probable Omega. Not a single Beta in the lot. In a fit of pique, he'd had the Alpha put down, paying the massive Bureau fine. Unregistered alphas, it seemed, had no basic human rights. Their lives were governed by contracts held by wealthy betas, their sole purpose to breed like livestock. Death was just a costly business expense for their owners. The evening culminated in a presentation. Several exquisite S-class omegas were brought onto a stage, rare treasures under heavy guard. Julian told Caleb that he could have any one of them. Caleb's face was pale. He pleaded with Julian, asking if they could please leave. Suddenly, a panicked cry went through the crowd. Someone's alpha was going into rut. Julian acknowledged it was his. The host, an old acquaintance, generously offered the use of his prize omega, a young man named Silas, to soothe Caleb. Silas had been bred from birth to be the perfect consort and was considered the top candidate to be Julian's future partner-in-law. The moment he caught Caleb's scent, his legs went weak. Their compatibility was clearly off the charts. Julian settled into a chair to wait for the result, listening to another beta drone on about the stock market. The wait was shattered by a loud crash as the door to the private room burst open. Caleb stood there, panting, his face smeared with blood. Despite being in the throes of his rut, his training held. He begged Julian, his voice cracking, to take him away. The host rushed inside and found Silas unconscious, the gland on his neck a mess of torn flesh. Caleb had savaged a top-tier omega. The sentence for such an act should have been decades of imprisonment, if not death. Caleb stood numbly, awaiting his fate. He never imagined Julian had the power to make him a free man. Julian handled it with cool detachment. He made a deal with Silas's family. He asked the young Omega if he wanted Caleb locked away while he underwent reconstructive surgery only to return to the same gilded cage, or if he wanted true freedom. Kneeling, Silas had begged for freedom. Later, Julian found Caleb looking lost. A sliver of pity pierced Julian's practiced indifference. 6 months ago, this man had been a brilliant scholar with the world at his feet. Now he was a tool whose personality was being systematically erased by the rules of their society. Acting on an impulse he didn't fully understand, Julian pulled Caleb's rigid body into an embrace. He promised Caleb that if he stayed by his side, he would keep him safe. The more Caleb saw of the world from Julian's vantage point, the more he understood how fortunate he was. Julian didn't loan him out for stud like a prize bull. He gave him meaningful work and respected his feelings as much as the system allowed. They once witnessed a frenzied alpha being beaten to death in public by his beta owner. The killer made a brief appearance at a bureau tribunal and then walked away to the sounds of the alpha's family weeping. The scene was so brutally cold it was hard to watch. The next day, Caleb was even more attentive, insisting on performing tasks like tying Julian's tie. One morning, Caleb knelt before him, presenting the back of his neck. He informed Julian that his rut was approaching and it was time for a preventative suppressor. Julian sighed, asking if Caleb couldn't do it himself. Caleb insisted it was the rule. Julian efficiently administered the injection. The alpha's breath hitched. He thanked his boss. Finding a high-compatibility omega for Caleb became exponentially harder after the incident with Silas. The community of S-class omegas was small and fiercely protected. However, a tech boom newcomer, a female beta, offered to let her omega meet with Caleb. She had, against all convention, fallen for her own contracted alpha and no longer needed the omega for breeding purposes. Most people in their circle turned a blind eye to such arrangements. Caleb, however, stared at the affectionate couple, his eyes wide with a strange intensity. The female beta smirked at Julian, remarking on his timeless appeal across all designations. Julian downed his drink, cutting the topic short. After that, Julian abandoned the search. He decided he would take the child once Caleb got his partner pregnant, but he was done trying to arrange the marriage. He mused aloud that if his adoptive mother, Ms. Adler, wasn't so insistent, he wouldn't even want the child. The new Omega was an 80% match for Caleb, technically acceptable. But Caleb showed no interest, recoiling from any contact. A less patient owner would have drugged them both and forced the issue. Julian simply paid the female beta a generous fee for her time and left with Caleb. On the way home, Caleb asked if it was common for betas and alphas to be together. Julian replied that it was rare to see a public, committed couple. He eyed Caleb coolly, asking if that's what he was after, stating plainly that he had no interest in alphas. It didn't deter him. Later that night, water streamed down the contours of Caleb's muscles as he knelt before Julian. His face, finer featured than most alphas, was flushed, his eyes a turbulent mix of supplication and desire. Julian scoffed and looked away. He told Caleb that an Omega had tried the same thing 4 years ago. Caleb asked if Julian had indulged him. Julian said no. The Omega had run off with his fated alpha, and then he had died. Julian leaned in, brushing a damp strand of hair from Caleb's forehead. He warned Caleb that if he said yes, he would walk the same path. It would be better for both of them to stick to the arrangement and part ways cleanly. Caleb chose to follow his desire. He crossed the line, his lips pressing against Julian's. When Julian didn't resist, he grew bolder, pushing him down into the soft bed. The alpha pleaded with him, whispering that he was different. Julian reminded him that it would only be Caleb who would suffer the consequences. Undeterred, Caleb's lips trailed along his neck. Seeing his persistence, Julian relented. His fingers traced the line of Caleb's spine as he gave his final ultimatum: not to do anything too reckless. Julian sometimes wondered if Caleb's every action had been a calculated part of a long-term strategy. He slowed the search for an Omega. He no longer asked for suppressants during his ruts, asking for Julian instead. And despite repeated he left a bite mark on Julian's neck that took a week to fade. It was audacious, or perhaps Julian had simply indulged him too much. He was examining the mark in the mirror when Caleb wrapped his arms around him from behind, still not satisfied from the night before. His rut had 2 days left. Julian pried his hands off his waist, telling him to use a suppressor. His mother had summoned him home for dinner and explicitly told him not to bring the dog. Ms. Adler was a sharp woman. She saw the overlapping bite marks on his neck, and her smile was glacial. She informed him that the beta-alpha couple he'd met recently had ended in tragedy. The alpha had cheated during a rut, and the beta had stabbed him before taking his own life. Julian fiddled with the floral centerpiece, retorting that Caleb wouldn't dare. Ms. Adler questioned if he was suddenly showing concern for his non-biological son. She said she just didn't want him to die foolishly. Then she changed the subject, announcing that his adoptive brother, Ethan, would be joining the company to learn the ropes. Julian cut her off, knowing it was a power grab. He stated bluntly he had no intention of handing over control. Ms. Adler sighed, declaring that their relationship, such as it was, had come to an end. 4 years ago, she had provided him with an alpha. Today, she provided him with an Omega. The compatibility rating with Caleb was 98%, a number so high the Bureau would likely bind them for life. To make matters worse, Caleb's rut was beginning. His eyes were crimson. He begged Julian not to make him go, to get him away from there. The S-Class Omega stood silently, a picture of placid acceptance, his scent flooding the room. The Alpha's hand gripped Julian's arm, veins standing out in sharp relief. He pleaded, tears welling in his eyes, begging Julian to take him away. A bureau official coughed pointedly, reminding Julian to leave them to it. Caleb pulled Julian into a fierce embrace, his hot tears soaking into Julian's collar. He insisted that Julian loved him, that he wouldn't be able to give him away. Julian felt a phantom ache from the fresh marks on his neck. He remembered another voice saying those same words to him, for years ago. He pushed Caleb away forcefully, his voice gentle but firm. He hoped Caleb would be happy. As he turned, Caleb's voice, now cold as ice, asked if this was his choice. Julian couldn't answer. The official closed the door, cutting off the Alpha's frozen stare. 5 hours later, the silence from the room became unsettling. They opened the door to find the pristine Omega unconscious on the bed, fully clothed. Caleb was gone. The bureau vultures descended, demanding Julian pay for the loss of an S-class Alpha. He signed the papers without argument. His first words after putting down the pen were a quiet order to grant them their freedom. He hadn't expected Ms. Adler's declaration to take effect so swiftly. The car crash was too convenient, the location too remote, the ambulance too slow. Everyone was looking out for themselves. Pinned in the wreckage, Julian felt a drop of rain on his hand. Before he lost consciousness, he saw his own security detail injecting him with something, apologizing that it was on Ms. Adler's orders. He awoke not in a hospital, but in a small, plain apartment. He was naked. The door opened and Caleb was there, a mocking smile on his face. He asked if Julian was afraid someone had stolen his organs. Julian was speechless. Caleb explained coolly that according to the news, Julian Adler was dead. He was now a non-person. Julian processed this with the detached calm his upbringing had instilled in him. He met Caleb's gaze, the corners of his mouth lifting into a familiar, cynical curve. He asked if Caleb intended to turn the tables, to keep him locked up for a while. Caleb gripped his chin. He said Julian could leave, but on one condition. He would give Julian the heir he so desperately needed, but Julian wouldn't be allowed to leave until he was pregnant. Caleb was serious. He bit down on the soft skin of Julian's neck, a bruising, possessive act. As Julian faded into unconsciousness, he managed to ask what Caleb's scent smelled like. Caleb wiped the sweat from his nose and answered with a single word. Gardenius. It was a shame, Julian thought, that he still couldn't smell it. His captivity was not the dungeon he'd imagined. Caleb was not a monster. He was possessive, yes, and his demands were relentless at times, but he also took Julian out of the apartment to meet his parents. He wasn't afraid Julian would run. He knew Julian was smart enough to understand that he was safer here than anywhere else. Caleb's parents were a low-ranking Alpha-Omega pair, and their home was filled with a warmth Julian had never known. They initially mistook Julian for an Omega, so heavily was Caleb's scent marking him. Mrs. Thorne was delighted to learn he was a beta, remarking on how much easier life was without the monthly troubles. The atmosphere was so different from the cold, transactional world of the Adlers. On the drive home, during a red light, Julian leaned over and kissed a stunned Caleb. Caleb found a new job, one that paid a fraction of Julian's childhood allowance, but he was good at it, climbing the ladder with startling speed. One overcast afternoon, Julian placed a large bandage over the marks on his neck and went to the cemetery. It had been 4 years since Leo's grave was filled, and Julian was his only visitor. Or so he thought. A man in a dark suit stood there, his expression grim. It was Leo's fated Alpha, matured by 4 years of guilt. The sight of him filled Julian with a white-hot rage. The man looked at him, confused, and asked when he'd gotten involved with an Alpha. Julian grabbed the fresh flowers from the headstone and beat him with them, screaming that he had no right to be there. He came home to find Caleb already there, his face darkening as he saw Julian's bruised cheek. He grabbed Julian, his grip tight, sniffing at his collar. He demanded to know where Julian had been. Julian, still buzzing with anger, told him to shut up, that it was none of his business. Caleb's response was immediate and physical. He threw Julian onto the sofa, his movements rough as he tore at Julian's clothes. Julian went limp, his fight gone, and stared blankly at the ceiling. Caleb suddenly pulled him up, his arms locking around Julian's back. He went to bite Julian's neck but stopped at the sight of the bandage. His anger seemed to intensify. He ripped it off and bit down hard on the bruised skin underneath. Pain shot through Julian, and to his horror, his voice came out as a sob. He begged Caleb to be gentle, explaining that he was having a very bad day. Caleb's face changed instantly. He let go, his expression horrified. He asked if Julian was crying, his voice suddenly soft. He pulled away, grabbing tissues to wipe at Julian's tears, apologizing over and over. He asked if Julian had been to see Leo. The question was so astute it was chilling. Caleb admitted he had placed a tracker on him. He had looked up the Omega from Julian's past and knew it was the anniversary of his death. Julian gave a self-mocking laugh. He confirmed it. Caleb asked who the Alpha was. Realization dawned on Julian. That was the source of his jealous rage. He explained it was Leo's Alpha, and they had fought. Caleb's tension eased. He said he despised alphas like that, all instinct and no humanity, and that Julian did well to fight him. Julian managed a weak smile, thinking of Caleb in the cage. Caleb cut him off, his tone defensive, saying that didn't count. He'd been in a desperate place back then. In the light of the living room, the full extent of Julian's injuries was stark. Caleb insisted on taking him to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with a hairline fracture in his pinky. It was splinted and wrapped. Before Julian could joke about it, the doctor and Omega asked Caleb to step outside. She closed the door. She confirmed Julian was a beta, something his heavy scent marking made ambiguous. Then she told him he was pregnant. That night, tucked in bed while a storm raged outside, Caleb held him close. He told Julian, out of nowhere, that none of it was his fault. He said that the blame lay with the system, with the tyranny of biology, but not with him. The words unlocked something in Julian. He remembered finding Leo with his faded Alpha, the sickeningly sweet scent in the air. He remembered his own blind rage, his fists against a wall of superior strength, the taste of his own blood. The Bureau had absolved the Alpha, citing a 93% compatibility match. But Julian had never stopped believing the man was a criminal. He began to tremble, and Caleb held him tighter, pressing soft kisses to his forehead, repeating the kind lie over and over. It wasn't his fault. But how could it not be? He hadn't understood Leo's pain. He was supposed to be his partner, his support, but he had turned away, disgusted by a biological betrayal Leo couldn't control. Leo had gotten pregnant and had turned to a back alley clinic. He became one of their statistics. The Bureau made Julian pay a fine, but Leo was gone forever. Caleb held his face, forcing Julian to look at him, promising he would always be there. He wiped Julian's tears until dawn. He didn't forget Caleb's condition for his freedom. Armed with his new knowledge, he went to a different underground clinic, the same kind of wretched place that had killed Leo. As he sat on a cold metal chair, he overheard another beta on the phone, telling someone the trouble was gone. The doctor confirmed his pregnancy and told him the medication was quick, though not without risks. Julian put a stack of cash on the table and said he'd be back for it tomorrow. Outside, a familiar luxury car was waiting. The window rolled down to reveal his adoptive brother, Ethan. His first words were a cheerful congratulations on the impending arrival of his niece. Ethan explained that he'd had Julian investigated. He'd come to ask him to return to the company. He admitted he wasn't capable of running it, that he had even had his own scent glands surgically removed in a desperate bid to prove his commitment. But it wasn't enough. He was losing control. Ms. Adler didn't want him to contact Julian, but he was desperate. He pleaded with Julian to come back, for Leo's sake, and for the sake of his child's father. That night, Julian told Caleb about Ethan's offer. Caleb, his arm tight around Julian's waist, said he would support whatever he decided. Then he confessed. He told Julian he loved him. He explained the terror he'd felt when Julian had left him with Silas, how he'd believed Julian loved him too and would be possessive of him. He admitted he was insecure, that he knew Julian saw him as just another alpha who could lose control at any moment. He offered to have his glands removed if it would give Julian peace of mind. Julian let the silence stretch before delivering his own news. The last checkup confirmed he was pregnant. Caleb's shock turned to pure joy. Then Julian added that he had gone to the clinic that afternoon. The joy on Caleb's face froze, then shattered. He shot out of bed, switching on the light, his voice rising in anger and fear. He demanded to know why Julian hadn't told him, ranting about the clinic's mortality rate. Then his anger collapsed into self-loathing. He stammered that it was all his fault, that his ultimatum had driven Julian to this. As Caleb began to cry, Julian delivered the last part of the story. The appointment was for the next day. As they finally drifted off to sleep, Caleb whispered that he loved him. Julian replied that he knew. After several more declarations, Julian finally sighed and whispered it back. He also asked if they could get a few gardenia plants. A month after his return, Ms. Adler announced her retirement. Julian and Ethan began the arduous work of pushing for reform. The alpha who had ruined Leo's life was made a public example of and imprisoned. When Julian next visited Leo's grave, he could finally smile. Caleb never joined him at the graveside. He always waited by the cemetery gates, a quiet acknowledgement of a history that wasn't his. He was, Julian knew, absurdly jealous of a dead man. They were late. Julian shrugged. They were busy men. The reason for their rush was a meeting with his birth mother. She had contacted Caleb a few months prior, wanting to see him. She was a lean alpha woman with Julian's eyes. She seemed nervous. Hearing he'd had a child, Julian replied flatly that he got rid of it. She flinched. Caleb interjected that since Julian carried the child and endured the suffering, the choice was his alone. The woman smiled, saying she was just glad to see him happy. Before leaving, Julian left a check on the table for her honeymoon. In the car, he asked Caleb if he thought she would take the money. Caleb didn't think so. He thought she seemed like a good person. Julian agreed. An alpha-alpha pairing took courage. Caleb then asked about their alpha-beta pairing, and Julian conceded it was also brave. He then theatrically declared that beta-beta love was also courageous. Caleb narrowed his eyes. He told Julian he wasn't allowed to like other betas. He was only allowed to like Caleb Thorne. Julian smiled. He told Caleb to kiss him, and Caleb did.